Welcome, everybody, to this COP30 discussion event on operationalising finance. My name is Joseph Lewis, Head of Policy at the IES, and I'll be hosting today's discussion. This event is part of the IES's Road to COP30 online event series, which will bring together environmental professionals to discuss key themes on the climate agenda and priorities for action as we look ahead. COP30 is taking place in Belém, Brazil, from the 10th to the 21st of November, so very soon now. And ahead of the conference, the IES is holding 4 themed discussion events. This is the second of those discussions, and it's going to be followed by events on adapting to 1.5 or more degrees and delivering solutions. And details of both of those events you can find right now on the IES website. Today's event is going to focus on finance and how finance can support effective climate action, because delivering climate objectives, as we know, means getting large amounts of finance to the people and the projects that need it. Operationalizing global finance through effective mechanisms has been a major challenge of the last 5 years, certainly, so urgent action is needed on a global level as we look ahead to COP30. Today's panel discussion and roundtable will reflect on the big financial challenges around climate action, including priorities for funding and how to deliver climate policy in practice. I would like today to have 4 speakers joining us who are going to start us off with presentations from each of their perspectives, just informally starting the conversation. And we'll then have some time for questions before we move into a slightly more interactive part of the discussion, opening things up to the group to give all of you the chance, if you want, to share your perspectives around the theme. But we'll be keeping the panel as part of that discussion, allowing the discussion to, flow naturally back and forth and drawing on all of the expertise that we've got gathered here. Before I introduce our speakers, a few housekeeping points. Whilst others are presenting and speaking, please do mute yourselves and limit any background noise. But please feel free to have your cameras on if you'd like to. Similarly, you don't need to have your cameras on while somebody else is speaking if you don't want to. And when we get to the second half of the discussion and open things up a bit more, we're really keen to have everyone join in and turn on their cameras. I know there's always a temptation with these events to leave your camera off and just listen to what others have to say. But it really helps the IES to have your perspectives, even if you're just agreeing with what others have said or what was already included in the presentations. Regardless of your level of experience with climate summits like COP30, we really do value your input and your perspective on what other people have had to say. And if you'd like to feed in at any point in the discussion or to ask a question verbally, please either raise your hand by clicking on the React button at the bottom of your screen, or just let us know in the chat box, and I can bring you into the discussion in due course. You can also add any comments or ask questions in the chat box throughout the conversation. And if there are any questions in there when we reach the panel discussion, I'll put those to the panel directly as we start discussing as a wider group. Naturally, if you have more general comments, or if you want to debate and discuss with your fellow attendees as we go along, feel free to add those in the chat box throughout the discussion. Before COP30, the outcomes of all 4 of these discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which we'll then use to brief the IES delegate attending COP30 and identify what environmental scientists think are the most important priorities for the coming months. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll now introduce our speakers. I'll give you a quick introduction to all 4 of you. And then if you want to provide any more information about your background, you can share that once I call each of you up to present. But we'll be starting off with Bridget Reid. Bridget is an internationally recognized leader in sustainable finance with a career spanning environmental consultancy and investment banking before co-founding Frontiera, a geospatial consultancy helping financial institutions to address climate, nature, and deforestation risks. With a background in environmental science, Bridget bridges the complexities of finance and environmental systems. She's been appointed as a green finance expert to the UK PACT programme and is a trustee of the IES. And then after Bridget, our next speaker will be Robbie Epsom. Robbie is a sustainability leader with more than 17 years of helping organisations embed ESG strategy and drive systemic positive change. Formerly the EMEA head of sustainability at CBRE Investment Management, he led award-winning ESG initiatives and serves on multiple international ESG boards and committees. Robbie is a chartered environmentalist and a fellow of both the Institute of Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability, as well as the IES. Following Robbie, our third speaker will be Sarah Brownlee. Sarah is a Development Director of Rebuilding Nature, Program Director at Wilder Carbon, and also featured on the Ends Power List 2025. Sarah says she is driven by the belief that we need to integrate nature and climate resilience into our economic systems to build a more sustainable future. Absolutely. And Sarah's work focuses on creating scalable, investment-ready solutions for nature recovery through her roles at Kent Wildlife Trust, Wilder Carbon, and Rebuilding Nature. So by collaborating with stakeholders across different sectors, Sarah aims to develop approaches that not only protect and restore nature, but also demonstrate economic and social value. And then finally, our final speaker will be Dr. Justin Bishop. Justin is an operations officer in the Climate Business Department of the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which is the World Bank Group's private sector lending institution. He ensures that IFC's financing operations align with the mitigation, adaptation, and resilience goals of the Paris Agreement and identifies opportunities for climate and nature finance. Justin focuses on energy, transport, and telecommunications infrastructure projects. So lots of expertise and talent on the panel and lots of words out of the way. With all that said, thank you again for signing in. We're going to get started right away with our first presentation from Bridget Reid. So Bridget, over to you.
Yes, Joseph, thank you very much for the introduction and thank you for everyone joining today. As Joseph said, my background is in environmental science and I started working in environmental consultancies, doing EIAs and general sustainability consulting before moving across to sustainable finance. Since moving across, I would say my career can be summarised as attempting to operationalise finance. Ironically, I did still have to practice that phrase many, many times last night, and I will probably still stumble over it throughout the next 10 minutes. As the first speaker, I thought I'd provide an overarching context to what is operationalising finance and why are we talking about it now ahead of COP30. Then I'm going to go through some of the key challenges and opportunities that I personally come across in my day-to-day work regarding the topic. So firstly, what do we actually mean when we're talking about operationalising finance? It will flow soon. At its core, it's about shifting financial flows or moving money away from activities that harm the climate and nature and into those that help protect and restore. Right now, the reality is that there is too much finance, still too much money that flows in the wrong direction. Governments still subsidise harmful activities, and businesses and banks and banks and businesses continue to invest in and fund high carbon and nature destructive sectors and activities. Meanwhile, there's too little money that's flowing into emissions reduction, adaptation, resilience, and nature-based solutions. The kind of investments that could strengthen communities, restore ecosystems, and lead us into a sustainable existence. So when we talk about operationalising finance, what we're talking about is attempting to change the financial system so that instead of finance enabling harmful activities or just being passive, we want to use it so that it is enabling and driving outcomes that are climate and nature positive. So what does this look like in practice? So as I said, right now, a lot of money still flows in the wrong direction. So banks and investors continue to lend to companies that are damaging the environment. So for example, like large-scale agricultural companies that drive deforestation, or companies expanding into or becoming more reliant on oil and gas, or companies that are actively polluting rivers and oceans. At the same time, governments are still subsidising those same companies. They're effectively using our public money to support activities that harm nature and climate. So operationalising finance means changing that. It's about redirecting these financial flows. So instead of funding destruction, that money supports businesses and projects that restore ecosystems and cuts emissions. Take agriculture, for example. Rather than banks financing companies that clear forests to plant soy or graze cattle, we want to see those loans and subsidies going to agroforestry projects. So farms that grow trees and crops together, improving soil, storing carbon and protecting biodiversity. The same applies across the economy. We want to reward the positive actors. So use public funds, tax incentives and investment capital to back innovators, farmers and entrepreneurs who are building a sustainable future. Now, if we do that, if both banks and governments start financing what helps rather than harms, we have the potential to see real change and see us get back on track to that 1.5 degrees. So why does this all matter for COP30? So COP30 is being marketed as the implementation COP. It's meant to be a turning point. The moment the world actually moves from making climate and nature pledges to actually delivering on them. So for years, we've heard big promises about climate finance. We've all heard about the trillions going that's been committed by various countries, but we've heard less about how that money is actually really flowing and whether it's reaching the projects and communities that can make a difference. The Paris Agreement gives us a framework for this shift. So in Article 2.1c, it says that all finance flows, so not just climate aid, but all public and private investment, must be consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. So what makes COP30 so important is that it's expected to be the first COP where countries actually have to show how they're putting that commitment into practice. So not just agreeing to it in principle. That means demonstrating real change in how finance is governed, where it's flowing, and what impact it's having on the ground. So in short, COP30 is the moment to prove that finance isn't just being promised, it's finally being operationalised. So now we know what operationalising finance is, and I can almost pronounce it now, and why it is of relevance to COP30. The question then becomes, what do we actually need to do to achieve it? Well, you might not be surprised to hear there's actually a whole lot we need to do. There's heaps and heaps and heaps of things, at least 30 years worth of things if you reflect on the fact that we're at COP30 now. So there's hundreds of different mechanisms that governments, public and private banks, businesses, insurance agencies, etc., they really need to do in order to transform the financial system. And we have three other great speakers that will definitely speak on a number of these as well. So I've just picked three which are pertinent to my day-to-day job, where I work with financial institutions to help them invest and fund more nature and climate positive activities. So my three personal priorities at the moment are a clear policy direction, nature and climate integration, and more environmental professionals working in finance. So to operationalise finance, the single most important thing we need at the moment is a clear and consistent policy direction. Policy should be helping to move us forward, not holding us back. For a while, it did feel like we had some sort of clarity. With the net zero targets being implemented across much of the world, the financial system had a clear sense of direction. We are heading towards a low carbon future. But over the past year or so, that direction has become far less certain and much less linear. So we've seen governments start to backtrack or hesitate. So in the UK, for example, the government is now reviewing its net zero targets. In Australia, the opposition has been tabling abolishing them altogether. In the US, we've obviously heard political leaders discuss climate action as a scam. But even in Europe, which is, the global leaders on this front, the global leaders in climate and nature policy, we're seeing delays and revisions to major policies and legislation. So, for example, the EU deforestation regulations have been postponed or are being proposed to be postponed by a year. The corporate sustainability disclosure rules look like they're being watered down at the moment. So these shifts might sound technical or political, but they do have real world consequences. So, for example, I was speaking recently to a tech company that has developed a digital solution to help businesses comply with the EU deforestation regulations. So, providing a system that would trace supply chains and ensure products linked to forest loss. But now that the legislation has been delayed, their biggest sustainability service is suddenly in doubt, because why would you offer a service that has now been delayed for 2 years? So if I'm a business, why would I purchase a service that, well, I've still got an extra year, so maybe I'll purchase it next year. So as a result, this tech company, they're refocusing their business on transport instead of deforestation because the market signal changed overnight. And this is the challenge. When policy sends mixed messages, finance loses confidence, innovation slows, and investment retreats and progress stalls. So if we want to operationalise finance and to make money flow consistently towards climate and nature solutions, we need policy certainty. So clear, credible and consistent direction is what gives investors, companies and communities confidence to act. My second thing is to truly operationalize finance, we have to stop thinking about climate and nature as a separate challenge, as they are completely interconnected. We can't meet our climate goals if ecosystems continue to be destroyed, and we can't protect nature if the planet continues to warm. One crisis is driving the other. Yet when we look at how finance works today, we still tend to separate them. There are climate funds, there are nature funds, there's greenhouse gas policies, there's deforestation policies. All of these are operating in their own lanes. This results in fragmentation, inefficiency, and missed opportunities. So we need to integrate climate and nature into one financial strategy. That means designing policies, investment frameworks, and funding mechanisms that deliver both outcomes at once, cutting emissions whilst also restoring ecosystems. For example, a very easy one that we are all aware of, restoring mangroves. They don't just protect biodiversity, it also stores carbon, shields coastal communities in storms, and supports local livelihoods. Agroforestry, another great example. It reduces emissions, improves soil, and creates more resilient food systems. So if finance systems recognise and reward that kind of dual benefit, we'll get much better results. So when we talk about operationalising finance, it's not just about how much money moves, but how smartly it's deployed. My final point, which is another critical piece of operationalising finance, is the people. So who's actually doing the work? And I've even added an exclamation point to really drive this point home, given the audience I'm speaking to here. So right now, the reality is that most people leading sustainability teams in banks or investment firms don't come from environmental backgrounds. If you look at heads of sustainabilities across major financial institutions, you'll often find people trained in accounting, economics, public relations, or corporate communications, nothing related to sustainability or the environment. And that's a big problem because we're expecting the financial sector to understand, assess, and fund the most complex environmental challenges on the planet. How can we expect finance professionals to fully grasp the nuances of deforestation, ecosystem ticking points, or biodiversity interdependencies when they've never been trained on those subjects? There is a gaping knowledge gap in financial institutions, and it's holding back progress. So if we want to truly operationalise finance, we need more environmental professionals working on the inside, not just advising it from the outside. The financial world likes to make out that what they're doing is incredibly complex. It's full of jargon, formulas, and models. But when you strip it back, most of it just comes down to adding, subtracting, and multiplying dollar values. Environmental professionals, on the other hand, are dealing with real complexity every day. You might be modelling how changes in rainfall patterns affect species distribution, or how soil carbon dynamics shift under different land uses, or how forest fragmentation impacts the hydrological cycle. That's complexity at a level that finance really touches on. So my message to all the environmental professionals on this call is this: don't be intimidated by finance. You can learn the financial side, but they can't learn the deep environmental understanding. So it's time more of us stepped into the financial system, because without our expertise inside, we can't expect the system to finance the solutions that we actually need. So on that note, and before I get too yelly about this, I'll hand back to Joseph so we can move on to the other speakers.
Well, brilliant. Thanks, Bridget. That was a fantastic opening presentation. Really, placing the operationalization of finance in that wider context and why this discussion is so important ahead of COP30. And I think also it ties really well into last week's discussion on reimagining systems because of that clear line that you showed from how finance flows and how they're deployed directly shape what our systems can look like. And I liked as well the very clear actionable objectives in there. Naturally, the point on clear policy direction resonates very strongly with me. But I particularly liked your thoughts around environmental professionals working in finance, really capturing the importance of that role that interdisciplinarity can have in this conversation. So speaking of environmental professionals who've worked in finance, our next speaker is going to be Robbie Epsom. So Robbie, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph, and thanks, Bridget. I've spent the last 5 years working in investment management and 2 years before that advising into the sector. So I completely resonate with what Bridget's saying and the difference from being an advisor to being on the inside. And anyone who's been a consultant for long enough, you know that um, you get a chance to almost go away and look things up before you have to go back with the answer in consultancy. When you're in-house, you really have to understand how it ticks so you can be part of the conversations and really integrate it into everything. And I think I completely agree that it took me a while, but I have understood a lot of the finance world, and you really only get that by being on the inside. And I think it's invaluable because, as we're talking about today, really money does speak. We're a capitalist economy still, and if you can get money flowing to the right place, which often is easier than it seems on the outside, it's often KPIs and things like that, which I'll talk about in a second. Then really you can have systems level change across the whole economy. But look, where are we today? So my name is Robbie Epsom. I'm former head of or near head of sustainability at CBR Investment Management. My background's consultancy, chemical process engineer by training, and I think Joseph handled the rest. Where am I now? I am my own company, which is quite nice. So I'm Robbie Epsom Limited now, and I'm doing sort of freelance advice just for a little bit of a change of scenery. I think I learned a lot, and I'd like to try to share that with as many different companies as I can, getting a bit of the best of both worlds, the consultancy world, but without the timesheets. So exciting times ahead, and I'm going to speak from my experience in consultancy, being in-house, but also I've represented both the IES and also West London Business at two separate COPs, COP26 in Glasgow and COP28 in Dubai. So I've also got experience being a delegate lead, being in the blue zone, and actually seeing how this works in practice. So, what are we talking about here? What's the kind of big figure that really everyone gets excited about? Well, depending on which report you read, it's the latest is that global climate goals, all those NDCs added together and all the other commitments require around 6 to 7 trillion annually by 2030 if we're going to meet the goals that we're setting out. And as many of you know, we're far off this. So when it comes to operationalizing finance, that really is what we're trying to do, is get people spending the right amount in the right places. And the central theme for me isn't one of we don't know what to do. Actually, it's quite the opposite. We really do know what to do. The science works. The answers mostly are there. In most cases, it's a people problem. It's a bureaucracy problem, and really, we're not anymore at the point where this is a question of science of whether we do it. It's a question of the speed, the scale, and maybe the type of technology that we use to get there. And really, the mission, for today, for all of us talking to you guys, it's about how do we move from political pledges, corporate visions, to real pipelines of implementable, bankable projects. And in my session, I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. I want to cover the why, and I'll come at this from a slightly different angle to Bridget. Why is COP30 important? Why finance? Why is that so key? I think it's important to also define operationalizing finance from the investment management perspective, my perspective being in-house, but also what the barriers are. And then lastly, how we can actually overcome those barriers to really start to drive that finance to the right place at scale. So looking at that, the sort of solutions. So why is COP30 important? I was at COP28 in Dubai, and the big moment of COP28 was the global stock take, effectively the assessment of how we're getting on, the progress report, if we were to simplify it. And what's special about COP30 is this is really the first time that countries have had to come back with their nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, to really respond to that global stock take with, right, well, what are we going to do to bridge that gap and get us back on target? And a lot of that NDC is going to be about how do we finance that and how do we pull the private sector in on that journey. But also Baku has got there's that mission going from Baku to Belém in Brazil, that roadmap of how do we move from the unfulfilled 100 billion per year, which is currently still not met, up to the target which COP30 has, which is that 1.3 trillion annually by 2035. And that's a massive ambition, and that's only going to happen if we collaborate globally and the private sector is brought along by public sector policy and public sector driving the way. But I think also something that Bridget said resonates, and something I wanted to pull out as well, is I like it when COPs are somewhere which is almost a little bit contentious. And I quite liked the fact that it was in Baku, that it was in places like Dubai, the UAE, because I think part of the purpose of COP is to put it in the heart of where the conversation is the hardest. And when it comes to the climate side, oil and gas nations, that is the right place to be getting business leaders, politicians to be heading to have these tough conversations. And I actually saw firsthand in Dubai how effective that was, having those conversations, having business leaders on the ground, talking to locals in those countries, and actually telling them that they are going to be investing differently. Their countries are going to be shopping differently in the future. So I think that's really powerful. And in the context of Brazil, you're in the kind of lungs of the planet in the Amazon. And to Bridget's point on nature and the importance of nature, I think COP30 has that potential to bring both the climate and the nature agendas together, given the sort of context of where it is set in Brazil and where the where we've got all that incredible rainforest and so the so-called lungs of the planet. But also Brazil's got a very nice aim with this global mutirão, as they say, that collective effort, which emphasizes that kind of ethical and cultural perspective on that global stock take to really start to not just look at the numbers in terms of our progress towards the climate targets, but actually how can we do that in a way that brings indigenous people, local voices along, and actually considers, I guess, in more business sense, that just transition, making sure it's done in a fair way. So that's my perspective on kind of COP30, why it's important. But if I move to finance, why is finance so important in that context? As I said already, public money is insufficient. We're not going to get to these figures, the 100 billion, yet alone that 1.3 trillion by 2035, unless we rewire that global financial system. And that's pension funds, banks, insurers, investment managers, private equity, etc. And we really have to rewire it so that, to Bridget's point again, we're not just talking about net zero targets for the sake of it. We're talking about value creation, and we're getting these sectors excited about sending finance in that direction because that is the thing that will drive change. If we drive finance at where you look at the scale of pension pots, then you really do have global systematic change. But also it's that opportunity. So like I said, this is not just about net zero, it's about value creation. And one of the things I like to say, in my view, and sometimes maybe a bit controversial to say, I genuinely think that decarbonisation is an economic certainty. There are very few things where you can say that, but the facts are that fossil fuels are finite. They are going to increase in price. There is price volatility there. So we are going to have to phase away from fossil fuels. But also there's geopolitical issues, gas volatility, embargoes, availability, all sorts of things, which just mean that it makes business sense to switch to an electric-based system backed up by renewables. And the question isn't, are we going to do that? It's purely a question of time and technology. And to me, that's a very exciting investment opportunity because most businesses, most investors don't like to leave things to the last minute because you miss the boat, but also you're then landed with risk. So I think it's incumbent on all of us as sustainability professionals, particularly when we get into the finance world, to really remind them that this is not just about hitting net zero targets. This is about riding the wave of the next industrial revolution. And then lastly, from a finance perspective, it's not just the opportunity cost, it's the cost of inaction, the risk. And there's all sorts of figures that get thrown around for this, potentially 15% of global GDP annually if we get this wrong. But we all know for sure, whatever the percentage, that if we don't do this, there is a risk cost as well, whether that's physical risk or transition risk. And so if I shift into what do we mean by operationalizing finance in that context? What does that sort of look like? And I think it really is, as Bridget said, as I've already hinted at, is that process of converting high-level financial promises, this 100 billion per year, the 1.3 trillion, et cetera, that's coming out of these meetings, these promises, these COPs, into actual concrete, scalable, on-the-ground investments. And it's that shift from a political question to a practical question. How do we raise that? How do we deploy it? How do we manage it? And I think I see that in three pillars. And I think Bridget covered this pretty well as well, but maybe just from a step back rather than bringing in any environmental context. It is policy first. It's aligned rules and clear mandates. Exactly like Bridget said, putting that question into, is the Climate Change Act 2008 going to be scrapped? That is a bad signal. That is not what the financial sector likes. That creates uncertainty. It creates hesitation. Those are the sorts of things which we don't need. And that is why policy is so important. It's the foundation piece. Mechanisms, that effective financial instruments, that blended finance piece. I liked things like the Green Investment Bank. It was a great way of public money going in and bringing private sector capital behind it. We need more things like that that help to identify these opportunities, de-risk them, and bring the wider market along on the journey. And then it's capacity. It's those bankable project pipelines, the people, the local expertise, particularly in the emerging and developing markets that we really need to look for. But what are the current barriers to that all happening? And I think it's fourfold. One for me is regulatory fragmentation. It's not just the market signals of, we're going to scrap the 2008 Climate Change Act, whether they're going to do it or not. Those things do matter, but it's also the framework of things like taxonomies, the KPIs, the interactions between the regulators and the auditors and the investors, really getting that landscape fair, transparent, so people feel that they can partake. There's that lack of common language, so we're all speaking the same language across different geographies. And this is one of those things where EU, UK, APAC, North America, it has to be consistent because finance doesn't look to borders the way so many other things do. Finance needs to be international. But also it's that bankability and pipeline risk. It's that shortage of technically sound de-risk projects ready for large scale private investment, as I said, particularly in those emerging and developing economies. And I think also, as Bridget said, it's that misaligned incentives, those financial models that, they're often failing to price in environmental and social externalities, and it makes for unsustainable projects in the sense that they appear cheaper short term. I think fossil fuels is a good example of that. Subsidies and various other market mechanisms like the wholesale gas price being pegged to wholesale electricity price just creates a misrepresentation of the actual reality of that market and just makes it even harder than it should be. But just to wrap up, and if I finish with the how, so how can we unstick these barriers? How can we, as a collective of sustainability professionals, as we enter the COP30 narrative and all the side events and the blue zone discussions? Firstly, I can't emphasize enough how important KPIs are. It doesn't sound exciting, but it really matters. The financial world, and this is one of the big things I've seen from the investment management world, and this is why I was key to starting an initiative called Aligning Real Estate Sustainability Indicators, or RESI. And really, we need to replicate this for every other asset class. You have got to have KPIs that you build into those product structures from the beginning that give institutional investors, pension funds, etc., the confidence that if you're going to sell them something and build sustainability into it, that the regulators recognize that KPI, they recognize that progress, and therefore you're creating a safe environment the auditors are also going to recognize. And a really simple example of that is a brown to green value add fund. If I want to sell a value add fund and I want to call it brown to green, what do I mean by that? That really matters, because if you're going to invest in that and you're going to ask for what the return on investment is, it's not just the ROI, it's well, did you achieve that? And how did you measure that? And things like the EU taxonomy already give us those KPIs. There's a 30% reduction in primary energy demand, for example, for refurbishments. And so that could become that KPI. If you want to be brown to green, it means you've got to buy something brown, you've got to refurb it to the point that you get that 30% plus reduction in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And therefore you've achieved it. And you can say that that asset has been refurbished and has ticked the green box. And that simple change, and that needs to happen across the economy, it means you can build it into product structure and sell sustainability, which sounds counterintuitive to say as an environmentalist, but you need to be able to sell sustainability to be able to get capital from a brown place and get it to a green place. We need strategic de-risking. So public finance and public funds must be used strategically. Industrial strategies, not just as grant money, although that's got a place like we see with the boiler upgrade schemes, but really to de-risk that private investment through guarantees, first loss protection, etc. And like I said, I quite liked the model of things like the Green Investment Bank. And then it's capacity and aggregation. We've got to find that technical assistance to develop stable bankable projects in the pipeline and to aggregate those smaller projects into large, attractive investment vehicles. And then lastly, it's that regulatory leverage. Financial regulators, central banks must adjust capital requirements to reflect climate risk, effectively making high carbon assets more expensive to hold. And if I finish with a call to action, I genuinely think all the necessary capital and tools exist. I think our failure is one of implementation, not invention or innovation. I believe the will is there. As I speak, and I have spent time with institutional investors over the last 5 years, they really want to do this, particularly in markets like the Netherlands, the UK, France, Germany. They want to do this. but the barriers create nervousness to things like greenwashing acquisitions, and actually in some places are actually encouraging green hushing, which is also a risk. So our role as sustainability leaders is to push for the adoption and enforcement of consistent global standards within our own institutions, jump into the finance world, supply chains, market engagements, things like this. And it's that ultimate test of global cooperation is what operationalizing finance is all about. I like to say that finance transcends borders in the way politics often can't. And to me, that presents an opportunity for collaboration like none other. The transition isn't just an obligation, it's the greatest economic transformation and investment opportunity of our time. It's not about net zero, it's about value creation. It's not pledges, it's prosperity, and it's about taking it from vision to value.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robbie, for those reflections. I mean, good to hear about Robbie Epsom Limited. Maybe it should be Robbie Epsom Unlimited to really capture that theme of speed and scale. No, I think you give a really clear picture there of the measure of the challenge that we're trying to deal with here and how we can leverage that wider systemic change and open up that conversation with the actors who need to be making those changes. And I think your framing that this is a people problem, a challenge of bureaucracy, lines up really well with your view on COPs that take place in, where the conversation needs to happen, as well as that just transition angle, because it really sort of puts the people that we're having these conversations with at the heart of that. And now that we've had those two sides of the coin, why operationalizing finance and why doing so at COP30, next up is going to be Sarah Brownlee, who I think will be taking the conversation a bit deeper into the roots of implementation, with hopefully, I think, some clear examples of action in practice, maybe. But Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Yes, so zooming in, I'm very UK focused and specifically working in, I'd say, the kind of natural climate solution space. So I just wanted to give a couple of examples of delivery mechanisms that are being used. And how they've been designed, and some of the considerations that take a lot from what Bridget and Robbie were both saying there. So first and foremost, wild carbon. So bit of context. This is really looking through the lens of responding to sector needs with proven scalable impact. Through a natural climate solutions lens. So we know, the big problems and the big issues. We've got multiple crises, but focusing really here on two fundamentals, which are biodiversity collapse and the urgent need for further carbon removal and storage. We know that for these solutions, public funding is insufficient to meet global nature and climate targets, but actually voluntary nature markets offer a somewhat scalable solution. But trust and quality assurance are lacking. The sector demands evidence-based, multi-benefit projects with robust standards, monitoring, reporting, verification, long-term accountability. So it's quite a complex product and solution to actually implement. So Wilder Carbon have been doing this over the last 5 to 6 years. We've developed a standard which is very UK specific, nature positive for wilding projects that lock up additional carbon through the reinstatement of natural processes, which is an important point that I will come back to shortly. It's a not-for-profit, so it's really looking to channel business carbon finance into credible multi-habitat restoration across the UK. We sell ex-ante units, we call estimated issuance units, in advance, recognising that these natural climate solutions take time. So it's building capacity up front to deliver these solutions to realise their benefits over a longer period. All projects are independently verified. They deliver a 50% biodiversity uplift, as well as those tangible carbon tons being sequestered or locked up, and they're held on a non-tradable ethical registry. We are looking to build on this. It's a solution that has taken time. It's partaking in an extremely volatile market, especially for the UK. But despite this, we've been able to develop a really robust project pipeline across UK terrestrial and coastal and marine sites, estimated to lock up around 600 to 800,000 tonnes over a 50-year duration. Recognizing as well that what we need to be doing is encouraging positive action, decarbonisation, as well as further carbon removal. We've developed a good approved buyer network that's continuing to grow. These are approved buyers who meet our standard as having net zero targets, a credible plan and strategy of how to get there, and prioritising decarbonisation while also investing in wilder carbon projects to offset their residual emissions or remove further. We've identified a demand of around 7 million tonnes annually for these high integrity nature-based removals. So there's a lot of interest there, but the markets, again, the complexities around how to invest in these solutions is really difficult to navigate. So just moving on, I wanted to give you some examples of some of the projects that we have live. So here over on the left, Honeygar is a wonderful lowland peatland restoration project and the Somerset Levels delivered by Somerset Wildlife Trust, so really reputable, trusted deliverer. It was validated in 2022. It has a total estimated carbon benefit of around 40,000 tonnes, locking up over a duration of 50 years. What is available to sell up front is around 15,000. They've sold 464, but there is a significant amount on reserve that we're taking through transaction. So that's a really good potential amount of income going directly into a project that is not only locking up a significant amount of carbon, but also restoring a minimum of 50% biodiversity uplift on site. So looking at these dual solutions, these are addressing both climate, nature, and also, social benefits and access to nature. Somerset were able to secure 1.5 million in philanthropic investment for the acquisition of this site due to the supporting carbon income model. So it really has allowed them to access a good amount of capital to get the project going. The second is Boothby site, or known as Big Red. It's a project that's delivered by the Nattergal team, who are connected to the NEP project in the UK, a really high profile project which has demonstrated the incredible value of reinstating natural processes and restarting those natural carbon cycles through the use of large mammals. There's proven science to show how much more carbon can be locked up when you're reinstating natural systems. They were validated in 2024, just last year. They have an estimate of around 20,000 tonnes of carbon that they will lock up through their project over 50 years. They've already sold 10,000 of those up front to Arup, a consultancy, which I'm sure you're all really familiar with, large global consultancy. And then the third one, there's 4 live projects, and that's due to double this year, is Heather Corrie Vale, which is based in Kent. It's a former golf course, which I think is really interesting when we think about how we use our land and change of land use, which is a high consideration for government at the moment through the land use framework and the policy work they're doing around that. This neglected golf course is transitioning into a haven for wildlife, a wilding site, which again will lock up around 10,000 tonnes over 50 years. They've sold 451 credits, but again, they were able to secure 1.5 million philanthropic investment to acquire the site, based upon the future carbon mechanism. And there's also a number on reserve for them as well from other approved buyers coming through. So obviously this is examples of case studies that are happening, but what you can see here is that we have an issue of scale. We need these solutions times 10,000. We need the scale across the UK. We also need to be thinking about the resilience of these sites. In isolation, they're wonderful and they're starting to attract small scale finance to deliver these solutions. They're providing a product for businesses to invest in natural climate solutions. But we've seen the demand, 7 million tonnes annually, potentially leading up to 2030 to 2040, there's going to be a huge demand for these type of natural climate solutions. And we simply can't get the projects going quick enough. There isn't enough upfront capital to respond to that demand. And so that leaves a very unsettling feeling of the demand side feeling as though we haven't got the sufficient supply for them to put that investment in. And also for the supply side thinking, well, where is the demand? You know, why aren't people moving and putting their money into these projects? So there's a bit of a standoff. And I do think that it is really related to our inability to scale these solutions quite quickly. So another delivery mechanism that we are looking at is rebuilding nature, which looks more at the strategic level of ambition that we need to have to restore nature in the UK on a massive scale. So rebuilding nature is a cross-sector alliance, treating nature as critical national infrastructure, which again is a really important point that I'll come back to. Together, we're building a share brand to inspire, engage, and drive confident investment into our natural infrastructure. Our vision to do that is to create a strategic nature network which holds weight in land use decisions, underpinned by nature investment zones, which are the meatballs to the spaghetti of this connected network of nature, and fundamentally driven by the Lawton Principles, which was very heavily featured in the Dasgupta review. It's about resilient processes, restarting natural systems, locking up those, restarting those natural carbon cycles, but also providing natural infrastructure that makes the rest of the UK resilient as well. And this is a really important point when we talk about investment motives, because what the UK businesses are thinking about in terms of sustainability are their buildings, then their roads, their energy networks, their land holdings, and how we can bring resilience to them, as well as to a changing climate, but further supporting sustainable businesses. So natural systems can not only lock up more carbon and make us resilient to a changing climate in that way, it can also help to maintain temperature controls, stop our concrete from crumbling, reduced flood risk, etc. You all know this. I'm preaching to the choir here, but if we start to look at what that means from an investor perspective, when you have a nature network that is fully functional and delivering these ecosystem services that can make the UK resilient, you have natural critical infrastructure which is investable with an anticipated return of resilience. And that very much changes the perspective of investing in nature as a new scary asset class to we're investing in nature as our critical infrastructure, as a nationally significant infrastructure project. I'm not going to go into this because of the time, but I will share the slides afterwards. But this is just a bit about the why. So really to remind ourselves that the government has set targets for net zero, of course, but also for 30 by 30, locking up 30%, securing 30% of our land and sea in sensitive conservation management. If we are to achieve that, and I will share a report which shows this modelling, we can also lock up around 30% of carbon emissions that can be dealt with through these climate solutions. And so going back to the nature and climate, you know, COP30, we really need to be pulling these COPs together and looking at nature and climate as a whole and figuring out these solutions as cross-cutting. And so for rebuilding nature, you know, our target is going to be accelerating action towards that 30 by 30 by 30 with that climate target on top. And just a bit more about the strategic nature network and how we think it's going to provide a really useful solution to try and scale some of these natural climate solutions and deliver other nature benefits. The strategic nature network being a national construct that's going to overlay local nature recovery efforts and thematic initiatives. It's going to provide a single collective strategic investment vehicle underpinned by the Lawton Principles for natural process-driven functions through ecosystems. And so the three core functions of the Strategic Nature Network will be that ecological connectivity. As we all know, nature needs to move north a certain distance every year. You know, when you get down to the practical elements of this, the climate's changing, nature needs to move to adapt, and so we need to provide it with a nature highway to allow that adaptation, to allow for all of those wonderful services that nature provides, to make us resilient as a country. And again, going back to critical natural infrastructure, the Strategic Nature Network can provide that core nature network or highway that makes that happen in practice. Not only that, it provides a collective investment vehicle on a national scale. We can look at large scale aggregated opportunities to invest in nature, providing the scale and the certainty to the demand side, people who are looking for that security that there's going to be enough opportunities to invest if they go for that route. So that will allow strategic deployment of investment into nature for UK resilience. And of course, around decision making, land use decision making, and realizing that kind of strategic ambition to deliver 30 by 30 by 30 for nature and climate. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. That was a great presentation. I mean, we talk a lot about scaling up, and I think the idea of a strategic nature network really puts what that means into perspective. I really like that lens into provable impact near the beginning and the importance of those high integrity nature markets. And I think you can see a clear line from that back to Robbie's point about KPIs and the importance of showing impact in practice, which may be a theme as we continue the conversation. And I also loved the case studies, really showing what implementing complexity looks like in practice. How once we get comfortable handling complexity, using our environmental understanding, like Bridget said at the start, we can open up not just positive environmental impacts, but also social and economic benefits as well. So as we ponder complex systems, we're going to see if we can overcome the challenge of technological systems by bringing in our next speaker, Justin Bishop. We've had some tech issues, but hopefully we can overcome them. So Justin, maybe over to you.
Yes. Are you able to hear me?
Yes, we are. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. So whereas Sarah zoomed into the UK, I wish to zoom out to emerging markets in general and talk a little bit about operationalizing and finance in their constituent bits. And Robbie broke it apart a little bit, as did Bridget. So first, there's the financing bit. How much is needed, by when, and from whom? And in this context, I'll speak about the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the IFC. Then there's the operationalizing it on the supply side, and Sarah mentioned the mismatch in supply and demand. On the supply side, our Paris alignment and climate finance frameworks, but then also the demand. What is the demand for such lending? And then in the end, to echo Robbie's observation, having determined how much money to mobilize and having mobilized it, how do you assess that it's doing what it set out to do? Okay. So the COP finance gap has often been described as the difference between the climate adaptation and mitigation finance flows now and what is needed. Indeed, last COP, there was a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, which raised the annual contribution from $100 billion US per year to $300 billion per year. But it suggested that actually there is a need of around 2.7 trillion, of which in the context of an external lender, 1.5 trillion comes from external sources. You will often see this in the national determined contributions of countries where they will make an unconditional pledge to reduce emissions, and then a conditional pledge based on external support. Within the Paris Agreement, and Bridget mentioned Article 2.1c, and that is where companies, but multilateral development banks as well, were directed to align their financial flows with the mitigation and adaptation and resilience goals of the Paris Agreement. Effectively, a do no harm. There was also another sub-article which refers to the equity principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and collective abilities, or collective and differentiated responsibility, yes. And that effectively means that as lenders, we meet our clients where they are. On the do good side are the frameworks that were developed to support climate and nature financing. So there are going to be common principles on climate mitigation finance tracking, common principles on climate adaptation finance tracking. And within the last few years, the IFC published guidelines for biodiversity and nature finance. So at this point, it's expected that total MDB, multilateral development by climate finance, will reach about $120 billion by 2030, mostly to low and middle income countries, with an additional 50 billion going to high income countries. And that's the pledge that we've made. But you can see that that's about half of what the new quantified pledges come to. Within the IFC, we in last fiscal year, we lent about 9.1 billion in climate finance, which is about 43% of the total long-term financing that we committed in that year. And we delivered that climate finance, we did the lending and the climate components of it in different ways to meet our client needs. So debt, traditional project finance, equity, where we take a stake in the company's growth and success, and labeled products such as green, blue, sustainability linked. So that's all on the supply side. And, you know, the numbers are in line with our corporate commitments, but they were hard won. Because in the end, in meeting clients where they are, their climate priorities are not necessarily ours. Right? How do we reframe the climate assessments and the alignments to meet their needs and to meet their audience? Robbie mentioned transition risk and physical risk. As a lender, we are interested in the development goals being met, but also of the, I would say, financial sustainability of our investees. The better they are able to identify and manage climate risks, the better it is for us as a lender, and the more bankable and attractive they become to others. So when we talk about managing transition risk and physical risk, energy, for example, energy efficiency may reduce your operating expenses. On-site renewables may reduce your exposure to fluctuating import oil and gas prices. Pursuing sustainability certifications of agricultural products, or by reducing the emissions intensity of what you produce or sell, may improve your market competitiveness. It may reduce your exposure to import duties associated with the EU CBAM, or it may be indeed a unique selling point within the other producers of a similar product or service. And then, as I mentioned, the boosting or attracting this to investors, right? You're able to show to your shareholders and your external stakeholders that you have the capacity to understand what is coming down the track and put things in place to manage that. So that's all on the supply side. And as I say, we try to reframe it in a way that is attractive to clients so that we boost the demand side as well. So the third section talks about measuring that impact. So as a lender, we're very good at counting dollars out the door. But not every single dollar returns the impact that we expected. Sarah mentioned the ex-ante units. When we're going to commit a project and part of our overall narrative, it's all ex-ante. It's all what we expect to happen based on, you know, our best understanding of the project and the market and so on. But really, in the end, what happened? What were the results achieved? And so about 2 years ago, the World Bank Group developed a new corporate scorecard with a focus on results achieved across a number of outcome areas, including one of them being greener and blue planet. So millions of tons of GHG reduced, enhanced number of people with enhanced resilience to climate risk, and the amount of land and water area that's being sustainably managed, which is a tie back to the nature discussions we've had. But one thing that becomes clear is that not all of the impact is linked directly to financing. And there are times where you provide the money, but you don't get the impact you expected, and you need to try to understand why. So in parallel to this scorecard, which is very quantitative, we develop what we call a results narrative, which helps to capture how the institutions have helped to overcome the non-financial barriers. So, Robbie mentioned the need for common frameworks and a common language. Right. And so when we've been able to go into client countries and help to develop standards for green bond issuances, or tools to be able to assess more quickly the energy efficiency of buildings, for example. We've now, in the last year or 18 months, taken our specific institutional impact scorecard and tried to scale it up for all the multilateral development banks to adopt. Because, as mentioned before, we have this ambition of $120 billion in climate finance by 2030. We need to be able to show, as a group, our collective impact. And so we've developed this common approach to define, measure, and link global progress to our financing activities. So looking ahead, we know that climate and nature action is integral to achieving development goals. But as has already been mentioned, we're facing some financing headwinds on the supply side, which, combined with national commitments, are subject to change in priorities. Okay. So on the lender side, particularly multilateral side, it means that we adjust our posture. But at the same time, we can't forget the demand side, always trying to push the point that what's good for climate is good for business. And then finally, the ability to measure and communicate impact is key to all of the stakeholders. It's key to our shareholder governments. It's key to those private enterprises that invest in the IFC by purchasing bonds. It's important to other lenders that co-finance our projects. And ultimately, it's important to our clients to be able to see that all that was promised is being delivered. So I'll pause there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, Justin. I think that's a really helpful zoom out back to the global level, really showing us just how much scaling up we really need from Sarah's practical examples, but also a really interesting zoom in on the specifics of aligning these global pledges with the needs of the supply and demand sides. I think it's great to get that perspective of what multilateral lenders are seeing in this conversation. And again, it's another example of just how important the framing of risk is to this conversation, where understanding and articulating these risks is important to broadening out the appeal of financial operationalization to different investors and clients. And I think your point about results narrative is one that really stood out for me as well, because there is uncertainty in this conversation. And being able to link that financing to collective progress, being able to have that narrative is a really important part of this. If you're interested in getting involved in the wider work of the IES related to climate action, please do consider joining our climate action community. We also have 2 more discussions coming up in our Road to COP30 event series. This Friday on the 10th of October, we'll be discussing adaptation and resilience under the banner of adapting to a world with 1.5 plus degrees. And then next week on the 16th of October, we'll turn our attention to the issue of delivering solutions and how we can move from ambition to action on this crucial agenda, although we've done a lot of that already today. Both of those events are free to attend like this one, and you can sign up right now on the IES website. For now, though, thank you again to everybody for attending, participating, and thank you especially to Bridget, Robbie, Sarah, and Justin for setting us up so well by sharing your expertise and for such great presentations. Everything we've discussed today will help to inform our work ahead of COP30. As I mentioned, the outcomes of these discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which will be used to brief the IES delegate attending COP30 and inform our wider work on climate change. There'll be more information on that ahead of COP30 and shortly afterwards. For now, that is it from us for today. So thank you to everyone for logging in and participating. I hope you found it beneficial and informative. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in our CPD tool by logging into the IES members area. And if you're not already an IES member and you've enjoyed today's discussion, please do consider joining the IES or becoming an affiliate. It's the best way to support our science-led action on climate change and to gain all the benefits of IES membership. For now, thank you again to Bridget, Robbie, Sarah, and Justin, and thank you to everyone for attending and taking part. Hopefully, we'll see you all again soon.